The test of words. The day began like any other on the 52nd floor of Sullivan Tech headquarters, but for Carmen Johnson and her daughter Lucia, it carried the weight of years of sacrifice, quiet dignity, and hidden dreams. The skyscraper towered over Manhattan, its sharp edges glittering under the sunlight like a blade drawn across the city's skyline. Inside, the walls were lined with black marble, gold-plated fixtures, and art pieces that spoke less of beauty and more of power. To most who entered, the office seemed like a temple built to wealth. To Carmen, it was a fortress that had swallowed 8 years of her life in silence. Carmen was a cleaner, uniform pressed neatly, supply cart always stocked, every bottle in place. She had trained herself to be invisible, to glide through hallways with lowered eyes, to make no sound except the swish of a mop or the gentle spray of disinfectant. That was how she had survived in a world where power was often exercised through humiliation, where mistakes became excuses for cruelty. But this morning she had not come alone. Beside her walked her daughter Lucia, only 12 years old, her school backpack worn but clean, her shoes polished as if they were made for church. Lucia's eyes were wide, not in awe but in calculation. She measured the space the way a cartographer maps an unknown land, taking in the height of the ceilings, the thickness of the carpets, the way the glass walls framed Manhattan like a painting. She was not intimidated. She was curious. Rick Sullivan, the man who owned the tower and the company it housed, was waiting for them. He leaned against his massive stone desk, a smirk tugging at his mouth. His suit was tailored, his cufflinks gleamed, and his watch, an $80,000 Patek Philippe, caught the light every time he moved his wrist. To him, luxury wasn't simply comfort, it was a weapon. Every stitch in his cloth, every piece of gold on his shelves was meant to remind others of the gap between them and him. When Carmen entered with her daughter, Rick's sharp eyes narrowed. "So, this is the little colored girl learning how to dream big," he said smoothly, his voice like polished steel, cold and cutting. "This isn't the place for people with your skin color to dream, you know." The words landed like knives. Carmen lowered her gaze, her heart tightening. She had survived years by making herself small, by absorbing insults until they sank into silence. But today was different. Today, her daughter was beside her. Lucia didn't flinch. She lifted her chin, her gaze steady. Her eyes weren't filled with anger, only clarity, as though she had already learned that the sharpest weapon against cruelty was not fury, but truth. Rick chuckled darkly, circling them as if he were a predator testing the strength of prey. He gestured to the papers spread across his desk. "Here's something fun," he said. "An ancient manuscript I bought at auction. 5 of the top translators in the city gave up on it, called it a linguistic maze. Chinese, Arabic, Sanskrit, Hebrew, Persian, medieval Latin, all woven together like a trap. Tell me, little girl, what do you see?" Carmen's breath caught. She could already hear the ridicule forming in his voice, the humiliation winding tighter like a whip ready to crack. But Lucia simply stepped forward. She looked down at the script, her fingers hovering above the fragile parchment. The words curved and twisted across the page like rivers spilling into one another. "You said the translators couldn't read it," she said calmly. "Can you?" Rick blinked, surprised. "I'm a businessman, not a translator." "Then you can't read it either," Lucia replied, her tone steady. "Yet you mock others for not being able to. Money isn't proof of intelligence." For the first time, the smirk on Rick's face faltered. The air in the room grew tight, as if even the hum of the air conditioning had leaned in to listen. Rick barked a laugh, covering the crack in his certainty. "A poor black kid claiming she can read what PhDs couldn't? Stop deluding yourself." Lucia didn't look away. "I speak 9 languages," she said, her voice soft but clear, as if she were simply stating a fact. "If you want, I'll try." The words hung in the room like thunder before a storm. Carmen froze. She knew her daughter was studious, yes. She knew the girl devoured library books as if they were meals, stayed up late with language apps, scribbled notes under the faint yellow light of a second-hand lamp. But 9 languages? That was beyond anything she had expected. Rick's laugh rang out, sharp and dismissive. 9 languages? That sounds like clickbait. He crossed his arms. List them. Lucia began counting on her fingers. Spanish, native. English, advanced. Mandarin, basic. Arabic, conversational. French, intermediate. Portuguese, fluent. Italian, basic. German, conversational. Russian, basic. Each word rolled off her tongue with flawless pronunciation. The syllables were crisp, each accent nailed with precision. Rick's smirk wavered. His laugh was louder this time, but forced, like a man building a wall around himself. Anyone can say words. Where's the proof? Lucia's chin lifted. The New York Public Library offers free language classes after school. Mr. Ahmed teaches Arabic. He used to be a professor in Damascus. Mrs. Wong teaches Mandarin. She was once head of a department in Beijing. Ms. Rossi teaches Italian. She cleans houses by day, teaches by night. They're not rich, but they're rich in knowledge. I studied from them. Anyone can learn if they're given respect and opportunity. Carmen's eyes stung. She had always seen herself as someone trapped, someone whose world was bounded by the mop she pushed and the rooms she cleaned. But hearing her daughter speak like this, with such poise and clair, made her see something new, a door she had never believed could open. Rick's gaze darted to the manuscript again. His grin faltered, his certainty cracked. Something about the girl unsettled him. She wasn't begging for his approval. She wasn't playing by the rules of power he had always enforced. "Go on, then," he said finally, his voice lower, as though it had lost some of its polish. "Prove it. Read." Lucia nodded once, her face calm. She placed her small hands gently on the brittle paper, closed her eyes for a moment, and then began. The sound of classical Chinese filled the office, sharp and luminous. The characters came alive in her voice, ancient tones cutting through centuries. Then she shifted to Arabic, her words flowing like a river, melodic and deep. Sanskrit followed, syllables like seeds, heavy and full of meaning. Ancient Hebrew, Persian, medieval Latin, each language distinct, each delivered with care. Rick's jaw slackened. His office, a place where power had always been measured by wealth, was suddenly filled with a power he couldn't buy. Carmen's hand flew to her chest. Tears blurred her vision. This was her daughter, the same child who had once done homework by candlelight when the power was cut, who had studied words whispered through cracked doors, and now she stood tall, speaking to the world in voices that spanned continents. Lucia looked up at Rick. "Shall I translate the meaning for you?" The words were not a question of ability. They were a challenge. Rick swallowed, his throat dry. For the first time in years, the word that left his mouth wasn't a command but a plea. "Yes." Lucia's lips curved into the faintest smile. She turned back to the manuscript. "It speaks of wisdom and wealth," she began. "True wisdom isn't found in gilded palaces, but in a humble heart. True wealth isn't measured in money, but in the ability to see dignity in every person. True power doesn't humiliate. It lifts others up." The silence that followed was heavy, filled not with the weight of marble or gold, but with truth. Rick's hand clenched on the edge of his desk. The polished stone that had always been his anchor now felt cold and empty. He wanted to argue, to twist the words, to bury them under numbers and contracts. But suddenly those things seemed small. Before him stood a 12-year-old girl from Harlem who spoke 9 languages, read 6 ancient scripts, and carried herself with more dignity than all his millions could buy. For the first time, Rick Sullivan felt poor. The weight of truth. The hum of the air conditioner filled the silence in Rick Sullivan's office, though even its steady rhythm could not cut through the tension that had taken hold. The polished black marble floor reflected the moment as if it wanted to preserve it. Rick, the billionaire who believed money was the sharpest sword, and Lucia, a 12-year-old girl whose weapon was knowledge, standing across from him like equals. Rick's face was taut, his jaw clenched. He had built his empire by controlling every room he stepped into, by ensuring that no one ever left him unanswered. People were afraid of him, employees, clients, rivals. Fear was his favorite currency. Yet this child had met his mocking grin with unshakable calm. She had read from the manuscript others had deemed impossible, and then she had spoken words that struck deeper than any boardroom insult. Carmen stood in the background, torn between pride and fear. She had never seen anyone speak to Rick this way, let alone her own daughter. Her hands twisted the edge of her uniform, her body trembling from years of learned silence. But her heart beat differently now. For the first time, she felt the possibility of dignity rising from beneath the weight of humiliation. Rick broke the silence with a laugh, short, sharp, but hollow. "Clever girl," he said, his voice carrying an edge. "But words are just words. They don't build towers, they don't buy companies, they don't put food on the table." He leaned forward, his elbows on the cold stone of his desk. "Do you know what matters in this world? Power. And power comes from money." Lucia didn't flinch. "Money is only one kind of power," she replied softly. "But it's not the only kind. Words change people, knowledge changes people, and people change the world." Rick narrowed his eyes, his smirk faltering again. Something about the steadiness in her tone unsettled him. He was used to defiance breaking under pressure, but this wasn't defiance. It was conviction. "Do you know who I am?" he demanded suddenly, his voice rising. "I own this tower. I employ thousands. I've crushed men twice my size, companies older than I am. No one talks back to me. Not clients, not rivals, not even politicians. And you—" he jabbed a finger at her. "You're just a little girl whose mother cleans my floors." The words were sharp, meant to wound, but Lucia didn't lower her gaze. Her eyes stayed locked on his, calm and unwavering. "You're wrong," she said quietly. "I'm not just anything. And my mother doesn't just clean floors. She works. She sacrifices. She's stronger than you know. Without people like her, your tower would crumble." Carmen gasped softly, tears filling her eyes. No one had ever spoken of her work that way. Rick's jaw worked, but he had no retort ready. The silence pressed down heavier. Lucia turned back to the manuscript, her small fingers gliding over the fragile parchment. "Do you want me to finish?" she asked. Rick hesitated. His pride screamed at him to end this farce, to throw them out and reclaim his throne of arrogance. But something deeper, something he had buried under years of cruelty, whispered differently. He nodded once, curtly. Lucia began again, her voice steady. "The second layer of the manuscript is metaphor. It speaks of rivers. Water flows through many lands, changes name, changes color, but it is always water. People may change jobs, wealth, skin color, but they are always human. Their dignity does not change." The words sank into the room, into Carmen's chest, into Rick's silence. For a moment, Rick looked down at his watch, his $80,000 trophy of success. Its gleam mocked him now. What was the value of gold compared to the weight of truth spoken in 9 languages by a girl from Harlem? Lucia's eyes lifted again, catching his. "The manuscript says something else. It warns those who measure others only by wealth. It says they are the poorest of all, because they've lost the ability to see light in others." Rick shifted in his seat. His pulse quickened, though he would never admit it. Her words were like chisels, cracking the marble armor he had built around himself. Carmen, emboldened by her daughter's strength, stepped forward. Her voice shook at first, but it grew steadier. "Mr. Sullivan, for years I worked here, silent. I accepted every insult, every order. I believed that's all I could do. But today, my daughter reminded me, silence doesn't keep dignity alive. Truth does." Rick's head snapped toward her, eyes flashing. "Careful. he warned. But Carmen didn't lower her gaze this time. She had lived too long in shadows. "You think power is measured in how many people fear you," she said quietly. "But fear fades. Respect doesn't." Lucia added gently, "And respect can't be bought." Rick's hand slammed against the desk, the sound echoing like a gavel. "Enough!" His voice thundered through the office, but the crack in his control was evident. His anger no longer dominance, but desperation. Lucia did not step back. Her small frame stood steady, her voice calm. "If you want to prove your power, then prove you can listen. That's harder than shouting." The silence that followed was suffocating. Rick's breathing was heavy, uneven. He had never been challenged like this, certainly not by a child, but he couldn't deny the truth pressing in around him. Finally, he sank back into his chair, his chest rising and falling. "You think you're so wise," he muttered, though his tone lacked conviction. "I'm still learning," Lucia admitted. "But wisdom isn't about knowing everything. It's about knowing you don't." Rick looked at her then, really looked. Not at her clothes, not at her skin, not at her mother's uniform, but at her eyes. And what he saw unsettled him more than anything. Strength, dignity, truth. For the first time in years, Rick Sullivan felt small. The condition. The silence in Rick Sullivan's office stretched long after Lucia's words settled into the marble and glass. Outside the skyscraper's wide windows, Manhattan glimmered in the late afternoon light. Cars like silver streams, buildings rising like sentinels. But inside, the world had shrunk to three people, locked in a battle of truth versus pride. Rick leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers drumming against the armrest. His eyes, usually sharp and predatory, had grown restless. For the first time, he felt the loss of control. He told himself it was absurd, a billionaire undone by a child, but the feeling gnawed at him all the same. Lucia, small and steady, stood beside the manuscript as though it were a shield. Her mother, Carmen, lingered behind, her chest rising with both fear and newfound courage. Rick broke the silence, his voice heavy. "You've proven you can read the text. Fine. Impressive. But don't mistake that for power. Words don't buy buildings." Lucia tilted her head slightly. "Then why did you pay millions for words written on paper?" Rick froze. The question struck Elwie. Ica blades slipped between armor plates. He had bought the manuscript as a trophy, a symbol of wealth, never imagining it would become a mirror. Her gaze didn't waver. "You wanted it because you knew it was valuable. But value isn't always measured in money. Sometimes it's measured in truth." Carmen felt her knees tremble. Her daughter was navigating a battlefield she herself had never dared enter. Rick stood abruptly, pushing his chair back so hard it scraped against the marble. "Enough," he snapped. "What do you want from me? Respect? Applause? A scholarship?" He waved his hand dismissively. "Everyone wants something." Lucia took a deep breath. This was the moment. Her voice, though quiet, carried weight. "You're right. I do want something. But not for me, for others." Rick narrowed his eyes. "Others?" "Yes," Lucia said. "For the workers here, for people like my mother, who have been invisible to you for years. If you really want to prove that money equals power, then use it to lift people up instead of pushing them down." Carmen gasped softly. She had never dared to imagine such a demand being spoken in this room. Rick's laughter returned, though weaker now, laced with unease. "You think you can set conditions for me? You—" He pointed at her. "A little girl." Lucia met his gaze evenly. "You asked what I wanted. That's my condition, not words. Actions." Rick's jaw tightened. He was not used to being given terms. He was the one who dictated them. But something about the calm conviction in her voice made him hesitate. Carmen stepped forward, her voice trembling but steady. "Mr. Sullivan, for years I thought silence was survival. But maybe silence is just another kind of death. My daughter is right. Respect isn't given by words, it's proven by choices. Rick turned sharply toward her. You think you can shame me into charity? No, Lucia replied before her mother could answer. Charity is giving because you want to feel better about yourself. I'm asking for justice. That's different. The distinction. And cut sharper than a knife. Rick opened his mouth, but no words came. Lucia continued, her tone calm, each word deliberate. The manuscript says those who believe themselves above others because of money are the poorest of all. Prove it wrong. Show that you can see the dignity in others. Rick's chest rose and fell. For the first time in his career, he felt cornered not by contracts, not by rivals, but by truth. He wanted to lash out, to reclaim control, but something deep within resisted. The office door suddenly opened. His secretary, a tall woman with sharp glasses, stepped in. Mr. Sullivan, you're 5 o'clock. She froze, sensing the tension. Her eyes darted from Rick to Carmen to Lucia, then back. Rick waved her out sharply. Not now. The door shut again, leaving the three of them cocooned in the silence. Rick's voice dropped lower, almost a growl. And if I refuse? Lucia's shoulders straightened. Then nothing changes. You keep your tower. You keep your money. But you'll also keep your emptiness. She paused, letting the words sink. And you'll know it. The words stung deeper than Rick expected. Emptiness. He had spent years filling his life with gold, art, power plays, but the word rang true, echoing against walls he had built high inside himself. Carmen's hand found her daughter's shoulder, steadying herself more than the girl. She whispered, Lucia, careful. But Lucia's eyes stayed fixed on Rick. If you want to prove you're more than your money, you'll accept the condition. Rick's hands clenched into fists at his sides. His pride battled his reason. His ego clawed at his chest, demanding he throw them out, end this humiliation. Yet some deeper part of him, the part he had silenced for years, was awake now, listening. The room felt smaller, heavier. The manuscript lay open on the desk, its ancient words glinting under the soft light. Rick stared at it, then at the girl, then at the woman behind her. Finally his lips moved, the words slow, reluctant. What exactly do you want me to do? Lucia's eyes softened, but her voice remained firm. Start by listening, then act. Raise wages for workers like my mother. Give them dignity, not just paychecks. And treat them as humans, not shadows. Rick's throat tightened. He had crushed billion-dollar companies, reshaped industries, bent politicians. But this? This request felt harder than all of it. The silence stretched again, thick as stone. Rick's face was unreadable, his pride and shame waging war. But deep inside, he knew. The game had changed. The shifting tower. For the first time in his life, Rick Sullivan felt like the walls of his empire were listening to someone else. The marble floor beneath his shoes, the gold frames on his walls, even the glass panels reflecting the Manhattan skyline, all seemed to lean toward the 12-year-old girl standing before him. She had spoken with calm certainty, laying out a condition no billionaire had ever faced in a boardroom. Respect those beneath you, or remain empty forever. The words clung to Rick long after he dismissed Carmen and Lucia from his office. He watched them leave, Carmen's hand trembling but her spine straighter than he had ever seen it. Lucia walked with her chin lifted, her worn backpack slung over her shoulder, as though it held more than school books. It held an entire revolution. Rick sank back into his leather chair, staring at the manuscript on his desk. Its ink was faded, its edges brittle, yet the words had breathed life into the room. His board members had praised him for winning it at auction, calling it a collector's jewel, a mere trophy of wealth. But under the girl's voice, it had transformed into something else, a mirror, a judgment. He tried to shake the feeling off as evening descended. He told himself it was nonsense, that a janitor's daughter couldn't rewrite the rules of power. Yet, as the city lights blinked to life across Manhattan, he found himself whispering the word she had left him with, empty. The next morning, the boardroom of Sullivan Tech pulsed with tension. 12 men and women, all dressed in tailored suits, sat around a long glass table. Screens glowed with charts, stock prices, and projections. Rick strode in, his usual confidence strained but still intact. His CFO, a balding man named Gerald, stood to present. "Quarterly profits remain strong," Gerald said, "but there's growing discontent in the lower levels. Maintenance staff, cleaners, cafeteria workers. We've had 3 resignations this week. Minimal impact, but worth noting." Rick's jaw tightened. Normally, he would have brushed it off. Workers were replaceable. Numbers weren't. But Lucia's voice echoed in his head. "Raise wages. Give them dignity, not just paychecks." He cleared his throat. "What if we increase their pay?" The room froze. 12 pairs of eyes turned toward him in disbelief. Gerald blinked. "Increased pay? Sir, with respect, that sets a precedent. Margins would dip. Investors won't like it." Rick waved a hand, though his stomach nodded. "A small increase, just enough to—" His voice faltered. "Show respect." The word tasted foreign in his mouth. A woman at the far end of the table leaned forward. "Respect doesn't pay shareholders, Mr. Sullivan." Laughter rippled faintly. Rick forced a smile, but his mind reeled. This was his world, the one he had built on numbers and control. Yet suddenly it felt brittle, as if the entire tower rested on cracks no one wanted to acknowledge. Meanwhile, in Harlem, Carmen folded laundry at their small kitchen table while Lucia scribbled in her notebook. The apartment was modest, its walls thin, the hum of traffic constant. But that night, it felt different. "You shouldn't have spoken to him that way," Carmen said softly, though her eyes betrayed pride. "Men like him, and they don't forgive." Lucia didn't look up from her writing. "If he doesn't change, then he'll stay the same forever. That's worse than not forgiving." Carmen exhaled. "You're 12. You shouldn't carry this weight." Lucia finally looked at her mother. "You carried it for years, Mama. Maybe it's time someone else tried." The words silenced Carmen. For the first time, she allowed herself to dream, not just for herself, but for her daughter, whose courage seemed to stretch further than the city skyline. 2 days later, Rick summoned them back. Carmen entered nervously, pushing her supply cart, while Lucia followed, steady as always. Rick was pacing behind his desk, the manuscript open again. He didn't look at them immediately. Instead, he spoke as though to the room itself. "I told my board I wanted to raise wages," he muttered. They laughed, said respect doesn't pay dividends. His eyes lifted, sharp but uncertain. "Tell me, little girl, why should I risk my empire for janitors and cooks?" Lucia stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "Because without them, your empire isn't an empire. It's a hollow shell. Towers don't stand without foundations." Rick scoffed, though it sounded forced. "Poetic. But foundations are cheap." "Not dignity," Lucia replied simply. Her words struck him again. He rubbed his temples, frustration boiling beneath his skin. "You think it's that easy? To just change?" "No," Lucia said. "It's not easy. But it's right." Carmen finally found her voice, quiet but steady. "You asked why. Maybe ask yourself what kind of man you want to be remembered as. Rich or respected." Rick's gaze snapped to her, but instead of anger, something else flickered there. Doubt. That evening, Rick attended a gala. Crystal chandeliers glittered, champagne flowed, and Manhattan's elite mingled in designer gowns and tuxedos. Rick stood among them, smiling, shaking hands, his laugh ringing loud. But inside, he heard only Lucia's voice. At one point, he excused himself, slipping into a side room where the manuscript he had been placed on display as a symbol of his wealth. He stared at it under the soft lights. The girl's translations replayed in his mind. True wisdom isn't found in palaces but in humble hearts. True wealth isn't money but dignity. True power doesn't humiliate, it lifts. He pressed a hand against the glass. For the first time in years, he felt something he had forgotten. Shame. Back at the Harlem apartment, Lucia studied late into the night. She practiced phrases in Russian, recited Mandarin sentences under her breath, flipped through pages of Arabic poetry. But in between, she returned again and again to the manuscript's words she had copied into her notebook. "Rivers flow through many lands, yet remain water," she whispered. "People change clothes, jobs, wealth, but remain human." She believed it, but would Rick Sullivan? The following Monday, the tower trembled, not physically but in spirit. Rick entered the boardroom again, this time with fire in his eyes. "We're raising wages," he declared flatly. The board erupted in protests, numbers flashing across screens, voices sharp with outrage. Rick slammed his hand on the table. "Enough. For years you've told me profit is everything. But profit built on broken backs isn't profit, it's theft." The room fell silent. In that moment, the tower shifted. For the first time, it wasn't built on fear, but on the faint possibility of respect. The final translation. The Sullivan Tower buzzed with unease. Word spread quickly through its endless floors of glass and marble. The boss had changed. Rumors floated from the cafeteria to the janitorial closets, from cubicles to the parking garage. Some said he had lost his mind. Others whispered he'd been humbled. Still others joked he must have been blackmailed. But one thing was certain. Rick Sullivan had stood before his board and declared that wages would rise, benefits would expand, and every worker in the tower, from janitor to executive, would be treated with respect. The board was livid. Investors were panicking. The media caught wind, calling it the Sullivan Shift. But inside, Rick Sullivan himself was unsettled more than anyone else. He stared at the manuscript again, late at night, alone in his office. The ink shimmered under the desk lamp. He remembered Lucia's voice flowing across its pages, the way each language had unfolded like a river. But he also remembered her challenge. Words aren't enough. Actions matter. And now he had acted. For the first time in his life, he had chosen people over profit. The fallout was immediate. His phone buzzed nonstop, lawyers warning him of lawsuits, shareholders threatening rebellion. But beneath the noise, a strange quiet had entered his chest. It wasn't emptiness anymore. It was something else. Meanwhile, Carmen Johnson pushed her supply cart down a familiar corridor, but everything felt different. Workers she had known for years smiled at her now. One even whispered, "Did you hear? They're giving us raises, benefits too." She nodded silently, but inside her chest bloomed a feeling she hadn't felt in decades: pride. At home, Lucia pored over the manuscript copy she had made in her notebook. She knew there was one final section she hadn't fully shared with Rick yet, the deepest layer of the translation. She had saved it for when the moment was right. That moment came sooner than expected. Rick summoned Carmen and Lucia to his office once more. When they entered, his posture was different. The arrogance was cracked, the smirk subdued. He looked tired but more human. "You were right," he said abruptly, addressing Lucia. "The board hates me. Investors think I've lost it. I may lose millions because of this." He paused, his voice lower. "But for the first time, I don't feel like I've lost myself." Carmen blinked, stunned. Rick Sullivan, the man who once sneered at her education, mocked her very existence, was confessing something like humility. Lucia stepped closer to the desk, her voice calm. "Then maybe you're ready for the last part." Rick frowned. "The last part?" "The final translation," Lucia explained. She opened her notebook and laid it before him. "I didn't read it before because you weren't ready. But now, maybe you are." Rick leaned in, his eyes tracing the faded symbols. "What does it say?" Lucia's voice flowed, steady and clear. "The greatest power is not in conquering others, but in conquering yourself. The richest man is the one who learns to see the poor as his equal. The mightiest empire is the one that builds bridges, not walls. To lift another is to lift yourself. To humiliate another is to bury your own soul. Her eyes lifted to his. It says the measure of a man isn't his wealth, but how much of his wealth he's willing to use for others. Rick's throat tightened. The words hit harder than any market report, harder than any rival's insult. For a moment, he couldn't speak. Carmen, tears brimming, whispered, "That's beautiful." Lucia folded her hands on the desk. The manuscript was never about languages. It was about people. And now the choice is yours. Will you live by its words, or just own it like another trophy? The question hung heavy. Rick stared out the window at the skyline he had once believed was his alone. His reflection looked back at him in the glass, not the invincible billionaire, but a man who had been humbled by a girl half a century younger. Slowly he turned back. "Then I'll live by it." His voice was quiet but resolute. "Not just for me, for this company, for everyone in it." Lucia nodded, her expression unreadable, but her eyes softened. Carmen exhaled, her shoulders loosening as though she had set down a burden she'd carried her whole life. The weeks that followed shocked the world. News outlets called it the Sullivan Revolution. Sullivan Tech announced sweeping changes: wage increases for the lowest-paid workers, scholarships for employees' children, free evening classes held in the tower's conference halls taught by volunteers from Columbia, NYU, and even the workers themselves. Rick donated millions to public libraries, funding language programs that mirrored the very ones where Lucia had learned. The tower, once built on fear, began to hum with something else: respect. Carmen, once invisible, was asked to join a workers' advisory council. For the first time, she sat in a room where decisions were made. Her voice mattered. Lucia became a symbol far beyond the tower. Articles appeared: the 12-year-old polyglot who changed a billionaire's mind. Schools invited her to speak. Interviews asked how she had done it. She always gave the same answer: "I just told the truth, and I listened." Rick Sullivan, for all his power, had been left in shock by the truth spoken in 9 languages. One evening, months later, Rick visited the Harlem apartment unannounced. Carmen opened the door, stunned to see him there in a simple suit, no entourage, no arrogance. He carried a book under his arm. "I wanted to give this to her," he said awkwardly, holding it out. It was a new edition of the manuscript, translated, bound, and dedicated on the first page. "To Lucia Johnson, who showed me that wisdom is wealth." Lucia took it, her eyes bright. "Thank you." Rick cleared his throat. "No, thank you. You reminded me of something I forgot. That respect is the only empire worth building." And with that, the man who once mocked a janitor's daughter walked away, no longer empty, but filled with something money could never buy.